Mr. Smith, I understand you've asked to make your own statement, and I will grant you an extension for 5 minutes from now to make your own statement.
Thank you, Interim Administrator. It won't take 5 minutes, but I appreciate your concurrence to my request. Thank you. And I appreciate the opportunity to address this matter. I wish to provide my reasons asking you not to rescind the motion per Norfolk Island Regional Council Resolution 2020/143, as been previously mentioned. Whilst it is not my intention, Interim Administrator, to provide a history lesson, which I feel it is important that you be aware of circumstances which led to this request for a Royal Commission into the governance of Norfolk Island and the relationship to Pitcairn Norfolk Island people. In my opinion, it is without doubt that the sovereignty and dignity of the Pitcairn Norfolk Island people has been compromised. The Norfolk Island people in earlier times and those that chose to live amongst us did so on the understanding that Norfolk Island was gifted by Great Britain to the Pitcairn Islanders and their heirs as a separate and distinct settlement to manage as their new home in much the same way as they had enjoyed on Pitcairn Island, and there is ample evidence to support this claim. There is no evidence that Norfolk Island was ever annexed to Australia. There have been changes to governance by parliamentary acts by Great Britain and Australia, but these have been negotiated without the consent of the Norfolk Island people. This includes from 1856 to the present day. Serious questions of legality exist as a result. The last Joint Standing Committee, titled Same Country, Different World, whose terms of reference was amended after commencement, highlighted the spurious nature of the process, and the resulting recommendations should not have been accepted. Had the overarching governance body responsible for Norfolk Island at the time had any consideration of proper democracy principles, we would not be addressing this matter today. The result of that inquiry is the driving force of why the Norfolk Island people deserve, amongst other things, an independent Royal Commission into the serious matters affecting the governance of Norfolk Island today. Accordingly, I ask you, Mr. Administrator, that you do not progress your intention as proposed under item 18.1. Thank you, Administrator.
Thank you, Mr. Snell. And the matters that have been raised by Mr. Snell and by Robert Adams will be dealt with when we reach item 18.1 to which we need to be agenda. I'll now move to item 7.9 relating to mayoral minutes, status reports and reports from committees, and I note that there are no items for consideration. Those item numbers, which brings me to item 10, reports from the General Manager, the first of which is item 10.1, recommendations for the appointment of 2 independent external members to the Norfolk Island Regional Council Audit Committee. Mr. General Manager.
Thanks, Mr. Administrator. Before you today's report that outlines recommendations to appoint 2 independent external members to the Norfolk Island Regional Council Audit Committee for a period of 2 years, as of the 7th of April. This follows the resolution that was made on the 24th of February, where Council had received this resignation from my former member, Mr. Chris Gallagher, who served on the committee for a number of years. And you asked somebody to go in on 2 highly experienced local government practitioners that had the basis of following skills and expertise, being a minimum of 20 years local government experience in senior positions, strong local government buying, knowledge of asset management, risk management systems, analytical and strategic planning skills. Today I recommend the appointment of Mr. Gary Mottow and Mr. Michael Shaw as independent members. And additionally, I recommend the continued appointment of Katie Sexton, who was the chair of the Audit Committee for the past 18 months, and that each of these 3 positions will be put in place for a period of 2 years.
Thank you, Mr. General Manager. I am aware of Gary Mottow and Michael Sewell and their qualifications from having been able to observe these in the New South Wales local government industry, observed from a distance, admittedly. And I've also met and sat through a session with Katie Sexton, so I'm familiar with Katie's capability as well. And I agree with the recommendation that is put before me. So I resolve, one, that Council approve the appointment of Gary Mottow and Michael Sewell as independent external members of the Council's Audit Committee for a period of 2 years, commencing as of 7th of April 2021. 2, Council approve extending the appointment of Katie Sexton as Chair of Council's Audit Committee for a period of 2 years, commencing as of 7th of April 2021. And 3, Council notes, subject to the above recommendations being adopted, which they are, that the Audit Committee Charter is to be reviewed and updated to reflect the change in the committee's composition and the tenure of its members. So resolved, and I will move to item 10.2, which relates to the Norfolk Island Regional Council Code of Meeting Practice, amendments to webcasting of meetings. Mr. General Manager.
Administrator, before you report to make some small amendments to our existing meeting code, and they are listed on page 30. But in essence, what we're seeking from these small amendments is that it's allowing Norfolk Island Regional Council meetings to be webcast, so audio visual, and the broadcasting of those council meetings to be via live stream. The recording of this webcast will be available on the council website for a period of 12 months. This recording is to be retained after being removed from the council website in accordance with relevant legislation applied to Norfolk Island from time to time. But in essence, this will be there for all improvement of public transparency and good governance. The changes that we're seeking here today are small changes to clause 5.18, clause 5.20, and clause 5.21, and they've got the existing wording there in the proposed amendment.
Thank you, Mr. General Manager, and you discussed with me also providing some advice in relation to permitting remote attendance in certain circumstances. Could you address that issue, please?
Yes, given the challenges that we've faced in the last 12 months through travel restrictions to and from the island, and it has been the same for councils across Australia, there were interim changes made to meeting codes across Australia to allow for remote access. Remote access means if you're stuck in Sydney or Brisbane or Canberra and we need to conduct a council meeting, remote access allows for you to attend the meeting via video conference. That has been in place for 12 months in the New South Wales system. And we actually used that recently through the most recent extraordinary council meeting that we had last month to consider a number of tenders. So what we put forward here today is an additional recommendation to allow for remote access to council meetings, all council meetings, whether they're extraordinary or committee meetings, remote access via video conferencing so that we can maintain good governance and also access when travel restrictions can pop up from time to time. A good example was last week I returned to Brisbane for the Easter break and Brisbane went into lockdown. There was a genuine possibility that I could not attend today. This amendment to our meeting code would allow me to still dial into the council meeting for it to proceed and not have to find additional resources to sit in myself.
Thank you, Mr. General Manager. I've certainly personally experienced some of the implications that can occur with the current COVID pandemic in terms of people's ability to travel. When I was about to come to the February council meeting, having been through Melbourne Airport about 10 days before that trip was due, I was served with text notices from both the Victorian Health Department and the Queensland Health Department directing me to isolate, to test for COVID, isolate and remain in isolation until I received the outcome of a negative test. So I understand the implications of those kind of orders on people in terms of their ability to travel, and orders being made at short notice and having an impact on people's capacity to attend meetings. So this report relates mainly to other things, but I'm proposing, because it relates to Council's Code of Meeting Practice, to add to the recommendations printed in the agenda another paragraph that relates to facilitating remote attendance at council meetings in exceptional circumstances. So I hereby resolve: 1, the council approves amendments to the Norfolk Island Regional Council Code of Meeting Practice 2019, clauses 5.18, 5.20 and 5.21 as follows. Clause 5.18. All meetings of the council and committees of the council are to be webcast, audio-visually, and broadcast live stream, with a recording of the webcast available for on-demand viewing via Council's website by close of business the next working day following the close of the meeting. Clause 5.2. At the start of each meeting, the chairperson is to make a statement informing those in attendance that the meeting is being recorded and will be made publicly available on Council's website, and that those in attendance should refrain from making any defamatory statements. Clause 5.21. A recording of the webcast of each meeting of the council and committees of council is to be available on the council's website for 12 months. Recordings are to be retained after being removed from the council website in accordance with relevant legislation applied to Norfolk Island from time to time. And 2, the council notes clause 5.19 is unchanged. And 3, that attendance at all council meetings is permitted remotely to cater for any potential changes to travel restrictions to and from Norfolk Island. And I will move to item 10.3, which relates to the proposed forward program of council business papers related to the implementation of the external audit findings for the period from April to July 2021. Mr. General Manager.
Thank you, Mr. Administrator. Before you is a report which will now appear on a regular basis for Council quarterly, where it will report back on the performance of Council's achievements towards the 113 external audit findings that was adopted by yourself at 24th February. This serves for a number of purposes. 1, to keep Council informed on our progress towards improvements in the governance and financial changes that are required for this Council to improve its efficiency. 2, it's going to provide a detailed report on a regular basis to our community, maintain our openness and transparency to show how we're making improvements for the operation of this Council. And 3, also providing a good mechanism for us to sit down and negotiate with the Department of Infrastructure and the Commonwealth Government in moving this council forward on some of the more challenging issues that we have in years 1 through to 4 that we've adopted for this program. As you can see here in this report today, is that we're making considerable strides for the short-term findings that we adopted back in February. Short-term, again, just for the community's knowledge, things that will be delivered within the first 12 months of the adoption of this program. The work program reflects a total of 29 EAFs being progressed over the period from April 2021 to July 2021. So that's quite a significant step. And happy to take any questions that you have in this process.
Thank you, Mr. General Manager. Am I correct then in understanding that there will be further reports, because this report deals with 29 of the 130 external audit findings, that there will be further reports setting out a further timetable that relates to the other external audit findings that are not included in this list. So
Yes.
Eventually, within a matter of the next 6 months or so, we will have a complete schedule of timeframes under which council is proposing to deal with the whole 130 recommendations. Is that the plan?
That's the plan. So what we adopted in February was for use of a better word, a rough plan that laid out all 113 within 3 periods, the short, medium and long term. So that was a rough plan. This is a more precise plan that will have actual steps taken towards each of these external audit findings. And some of those more detailed ones may require several steps, which would require maybe a report to council first to say this is addressing external audit finding 100, and we're required to go and get some additional resource, and this is the funding requirement, and this will take 12 months.
Right.
So there'll be a number of steps, but the idea is to have this report every quarter come back to council, so that the council, the community, and the department understand how we're progressing with those reports.
And of course, as the report points out, you have reached this position in compliance with the instruction that Council gave at the February Council meeting to commence initial planning of scoping work projects and the development of the detailed business cases and so on. Where necessary, some of the budget costs to be identified with delivery time frames, enabling Council to go forward and talk to funding partners about those projects that require significant external funding. So what you've produced here is in direct compliance with Council's direction. And I thank you for that. And I resolve that Council note the forward program as presented, detailing the business matters to be tabled at Council meetings for the period April 2021 to July 2021, and that the program has prioritised those external audit findings assessed for delivery in 1 to 12 months, as adopted by Council on the 24th of February 2021. And I'll move to item 11.1. The first is the reports from the Manager, People and Culture. 11.1 is the Manager, Commercial Services position.
Thanks, Mr. Administrator. Before you today is a report to recommend the removal of the position of Manager, Commercial Services from the organisation structure. Over the last 9 to 10 months, we've maintained that position remained vacant. And in that process, we have moved the departments underneath that manager to other managers of the organisation. And the manager of economic development has been maintaining the operation process for the liquor bond, manager of services maintaining the electricity team, and the manager of corporate finance maintaining the Norfolk telecom. So there's been an assessment made of this position, and we believe moving forward that this can be a significant saving to the organisation. So we propose today to remove this position from our organisational structure, which will save The salary is going to be 150,000, and added to that is superannuation, workers' comp, and other overheads. So it's a pretty significant saving that we're proposing to cut the organisation for you today.
Thank you, Mr. General Manager. Accept the advice contained in this report, and I resolve that Council approves 1. The removal of the Manager Commercial Services position from the organisational structure. 2. The General Manager reallocating the functional responsibilities for business units in the Commercial Services Group, Norfolk Island Telecom, Electricity and Liquor Bond, as follows. To the Manager of Economic Development, the Liquor Bond, to the Manager of Services, Electricity, and to the Manager Corporate and Finance, Norfolk Telecom. So resolved. And I'll move to item 12, the reports from the Manager Corporate and Finance. Item 12.1 is the investment report, Mr. General Manager.
Mr. Administrator, I'll hand it to Manager Corporate Finance Services to give you a brief on this report.
Mr. General Manager, the purpose of this report is for Council to note the investments held and to provide an overview of the Council's cash position as at 28th of February 2021. On the 28th of February 2021, Council had a total of 5.3 million in deposits at call, 2.21 in cash at bank, and 626,000 of funds held in trust. Within those two balances of the deposits and cash, that comes to 7.54 million. Within that balance, there are $3,765,000 worth of cash and deposits that are classified as restricted funds. There are two types of restricted funds, externally restricted and internally restricted. Externally restricted cash must be spent on for the purpose for which it was raised or received and cannot be used for any other purpose. Internally restricted cash is cash that is deemed to be required by the Council in either the current budget or for future years. Examples included in the restricted cash are, for instance, payments relating to the installation of airport security equipment, the payments on the Tesla battery contract. In terms of the internally restricted funds, there we're talking about employee leave entitlements and other payables that the Council owes. These are provided more detail in the paper for people who wish to read those. So as at the 28th of February, Council has an estimated unrestricted cash balance of $3.775 million, with, as I said earlier, a balance of $626,157 held in trust separately. And in my position, I'm certifying that the investments listed within this report have been made in accordance with the Section 625 of the Local Government Act, Clause 212 of the Local Government General Regulation 2005, and Council's investment policy. The recommendation is that Council notes that the investment report for February 2021.
Thank you, Alistair. I know I've asked you this question on a number of occasions, but I'll just ask you to update me, if you would, of that unrestricted cash of 3.775 million, taking into account projections of revenues into Council. Could you update me on your estimate of how many months of cash Council has to be able to continue to operate now? And bearing in mind that I understand that of that 3.775 million, Council is holding that amount due largely to the $3 million injection from the Commonwealth. But could you comment on
Sure.
the time frame, please?
Yes, that's correct. The Commonwealth did provide an additional $3 million. Based on our projections and assumptions moving forward, the current balance would last on the current projections around about July through to potentially October, depending on what other commitments may or may not arise in that time. So,
thank you. I resolve that Council notes the investment report for February 2021, and I'll move to item 12.2, which is the Norfolk Island Airport pavement repair and reconstruction design and construct project final cost report.
Mr. Administrator, before you use a very detailed report of this significant project undertaken by this council over the last 18 months. I know the lead time before that was much longer, but in essence, you've seen a very large infrastructure project delivered on island during probably the most difficult time for any construction project that required significant resources to be brought across from Australia during a pandemic. So hats off to Boral, Norfolk Island Police, the emergency management team and MD Group that were all part of this process. But before you today is the financial cost of this program, which is often been questioned by the community. So today, in our full transparent processes of council, we provide you a detailed report. So I'll hand across to Council's Manager of Financial Services to make a few comments on the specifics to this program.
Thank you. Manager.
Mr. General Manager, thank you, Mr. Administrator. Yes, the paper is very detailed, and I would encourage people to read it in more detail with regard to the specific numbers. I'll provide a summary of the paper. I believe there's some value in just giving a brief overview of the history, given that this was a major project and undertaking for the council and the island generally. CASA, the Civil Aviation Safety Authority, undertook an assessment of the airport in 2017, in which it found that the existing runway surface and aprons contained deformities such as cracking. And if they weren't rectified, then the runway, which is a vital economic link for the island, would be deemed unsuitable for commercial aircraft. The council at the time acted very quickly on this and engaged a technical expert, Dr. Greg White, who commenced planning to rectify these repairs, the repairs to the apron and the maintenance of the runway. The tender was called, released in September 2018 to repair and reconstruct the airport runway and apron, and this tender closed on December the 18th, 2018. At the 20th February 2019 council meeting, the council noted its support for the Norfolk Island Airport pavement and reconstruction design and construct project, which I'll say as the project going forward, and approved the award of a contract to Boral Resources as the single source supplier to undertake the project for the tendered price of $44.96 million. Importantly, Boral indicated in their submission that this price did not include treatment of the bulk aggregate and sand for transport to Norfolk Island that was required to undertake the job. Boral, in lieu of knowing the accurate cost at this stage, had estimated an amount of $4.2 million to cover such cost should it be required. Under the same resolution, Council agreed to contribute any shortfall of funding for the project over and above any funding provided by the Commonwealth of Australia by way of a loan from the Norfolk Island International Airport Government Business Enterprise. Also at that same meeting, Council approved the awarding of a contract for project management services relating to the project to Aileron Edge Proprietary Limited. So in summary, the total project costs approved by Council were for the principal tender, $44.96 million, provision for biosecurity costs of $4.2, and the project management contract for just over $200,000, giving total approved project costs of $49.36 million. In April 2019, confirmation had been received from the Commonwealth that the Council had been successful in its application for $43 million to assist in the funding of the project. So the project has been completed. The total cost of the project is $47.83 million, including the principal contractor costs and other project costs incurred separately by Council. These are detailed in a table in the paper. Breaking that down briefly, the principal contractor costs were $46.46 million. Project management was $500,000. The technical advisor was just over $300,000. Legal and audit costs were 200,000, and there was miscellaneous expenditure incurred by council on the project of just over 320,000. So if we subtract the funding that was provided by the Commonwealth Government of 43 million, the net contribution for the Norfolk Island Regional Council was just under 5 million, 4.83 million. I'd note in passing that if we remember that the original approved budget by council was just under 50 million, 49.36. So there was the actual final figure came in at just under 1.5 million less than what had formerly been approved. And just to provide a bit more detail on the actual principal contract value, the contract itself, as I noted earlier, was 44.96. There were additional costs incurred under the contract via variations. These included the biosecurity costs, which came in at just under 4 million, 3.74 million. Additional costs due to COVID related activities. There were some minor variations that were acted upon and agreed to by council. And there was also some funds that were returned under the contract, specifically relating to some equipment that had been agreed to be purchased under the contract. And there was also some waiving of some levy costs that had been included in the contract as well. So that's resulted in a net contract payment to borrow of around 46.46 million. So for that investment by the council of just under 5 million, 4.83 million, council has ensured that the airport runway is fully functioning and compliant for the next 10 to 12 years, securing a vital economic link for the island. We've also taken possession of vehicles and equipment valued at just under $1 million, including 2 dual cabs, a pneumatic tyre roller, a steel drum roller and 2 skid steers. It is arguable that the cost of these vehicles, $1 million, is an investment by the council separate to the actual contract or the work to repair the runway. It was recognised at the time that this was a good opportunity for council to replace some of its old equipment, and under the contract we were able to include some of that. So in a sense, the price that the council has paid has been not only for the airport but also an additional $1 million worth of new equipment, which is included in that total cost of 47.83. Other benefits that have accrued to the community from the project: the Boral project team injected an estimated 4.5+ million into the local economy during the COVID-19 triggered tourist downturn. This was vital in enabling local businesses such as accommodation houses and food and beverage outlets to keep operating and employing locals in difficult economic circumstances. Council was also able to engage Boral under a separate contract to reseal 9 k's of the island's most heavily used roads while on island undertaking the airport reseal project. Members of the community were also able to purchase certain machinery, materials, services and equipment from Boral when the project was completed. Council also took the opportunity to purchase additional equipment over and above the equipment included in the contract, which I've just noted above, including a new skid-mounted spray truck, power screen, and with the assistance of the Commonwealth, a desalination unit was brought to the island by Boral as well. This investment by the council ensures older equipment and machinery can be replaced and adds additional capability for council to provide services for the community. Lastly, the council staff and other community members were also provided opportunities to learn new skills when employed by Boral Resources at various times during the project. Financial implications going forward: the final claim from Boral has been submitted for payment certification by council and has been included in the total cost, and is included as an item in the restricted funds that were mentioned earlier within the investment report. So in conclusion, the investment by council in the project of 4.83 million was a significant but necessary commitment of council's cash reserves. In combination with other cash-related commitments that arose from having Boral on the island, such as the road resealing project and equipment purchases, it has, however, undoubtedly been a contributor to the challenging cash position the council now faces. The funding agreement with the Commonwealth required a commitment from council to contribute any shortfall of funding for the project over and above any funding provided by the Commonwealth. However, the council's decision to proceed must be measured against the risk of having a potentially non-compliant and unsafe airport runway, and the implications this would have for the local Norfolk community, particularly tourism, freight and medical evacuation. Analysis of the Council's investment must also note the impact of the COVID pandemic and the state of emergency declared on Norfolk, and the additional costs incurred for the biosecurity measures, which were largely in response to community concerns and Commonwealth requirements over and above what had been required in previous airport reseal projects. As I'd identified earlier, the benefits that accrued to the Norfolk Island community included a financial payback from Boral and also indirectly via new equipment. A regular maintenance schedule for the runway and aprons is being implemented to maximise the useful life of the new pavements. Council staff will also be developing strategies to ensure issues identified during the project, such as but not limited to the sourcing of materials and the preparedness of local contractors, are addressed and planned for before the next pavement reseal is scheduled. Council, as mentioned earlier by the General Manager, also acknowledges the efforts of the principal contractor, Boral, Council's project manager, Aileron Edge, in delivering a project in difficult economic circumstances with minimal disruption to passenger movements. Of note, finally, I'd like to say there were also no time lost injuries and over 123,000 man-hours taken to deliver the project, which is, for those of you who are familiar with developments and construction work, was quite an outstanding achievement. The recommendation for the Council is that the total cost of the Norfolk Island Airport pavement repair and design construct project is $47.83 million, including the principal contractor costs and other project costs incurred separately by Council. Council's investment in the project is $4.83 million after allowing for $43 million funding contribution from the Commonwealth. Council acknowledges the efforts of the principal contractor and project manager in delivering the project under difficult economic circumstances. And Council staff have commenced a regular maintenance schedule for the airport runway and aprons to maximise the useful life of the pavements. And planning will commence in 2021-22 to begin preparing for the next scheduled pavement reseal.
Thank you, Mr. Ernest Walker. Just one question, and that is about the waiving of the waste management levy. That seems to be a considerable figure. Can you tell me how that figure relates to what actual waste arose as a result of the project? Presumably runway construction material or something like that. And why was that figure so large in terms of the waste management levy?
So that figure was what Boral had provided in the contract for the waste management levy that would have been payable for bringing the materials and various bits of equipment onto the island. In negotiating the costs associated with the project, it was identified that the Council in some way had to take into account the monies that had to be provided for COVID and also for biosecurity, and it was conscious of the additional stress that was putting on Council funds, and at that stage it was negotiated that at that time to manage costs, any fees, not necessarily the 1.83 because that was what was provided for in the contract, the actual fees that had not been paid would be waived by Council in lieu of paying paying for the COVID and also the additional biosecurity costs.
So do I understand correctly that $1.84 million is a fee that would normally have come to Council into its waste management?
Correct. It would have been a straight contract because we would have had to pay it.
Correct.
So we would have had to pay it out and we would receive it back.
Paid out to
Boral under the contract.
So it would have been, because once we've got about 43 million, and additional costs we would have had to pay, so it was a straight contract. We would have had to pay them, it would have been better than paid straight back. So,
With a margin.
with a margin.
Yeah.
So we will move it.
Understood. Mr. Ernest Walker has read the actual recommendation, so I don't propose to repeat it. I hereby resolve to adopt the recommendation as printed on the Council business paper and as read by Mr. Ernest Walker. I'll move to item 13, reports from the Manager Commercial. I understand there are no reports, Mr. General Manager.
Yep.
Under item 13. I'll move to item 14, reports from the Manager Economic Development. Item 14.1 is the Norfolk Island Liquor Bond Sales Performance Report. Mr. General Manager.
It's just a short report from the Liquor Bond Performance Report, just showing that sales are down from 2021 as compared to 2020, a 22% decrease. But year-to-date total sales are also down 7.5%. So it was just keeping yourself and also the community informed.
So do I interpret it correctly that February was a particularly bad month if the average decrease over the period from July to February was 7.5, yet that single month was 22%? And is that, in your opinion, attributable to the product issues that council's experienced?
Whole.
Okay. All right, I resolve that council notes the Norfolk Island Liquor Bonds performance report, and I'll move to item 14.2, the White Tern Project conclusion report. Mr. Jerry.
Thanks, Mr. Administrator. Before you to report, I thought it would be quite perfect for you to understand some of the challenges that we had went through in the last 12 months. Council was very fortunate to negotiate during the COVID impact of the island stimulus package, where we received a rather large grant to produce a new tourism initiative to improve or restart travel back to the island once travel restrictions had lifted. So in February of this year, a project called White Tern, which was made up of a number of local hotel providers and tourism operators that provided significant advice to this project. And from that, we developed brand support and integration, site optimization, and digital marketing. But what we get out of the back of it is this fantastic new data collection processes. And it also provided us with some short-term COVID strategies that we put in place to actually track and turn around. So once the White Tern project went live in February, it showed in February 2020, according to all existing records that we had in tourism, was one of the better Februaries in recent data terms. But under our new COVID, new program called White Tern, we can actually track better data collection now and show that February 2021 was better than it was 12 months ago. And that was the best we had on record. So we've now got a tool that can show us movements and improve our strategies. And one of the great things that we see from this is that we're seeing a significant demographic shift to a younger and more independent traveller that is now coming to the island as compared to what we've relied upon in the past.
Okay, an interesting report, and an interesting way now that you're able to gather data and use it to interpret what's happening in that industry. So I resolve that council notes the information provided in the report. And I'll move to item 15, which are the reports from the manager services. The first item is 15.1, fortnightly meetings with Department of Infrastructure, external audit finding number 10. Mr. Jan.
Just a short report to put on the record, which was one of the findings from the external audit, which external audit finding 10, to ensure that we have fortnightly meetings between NIRC operational staff and the Department of Island staff. So we just wanted to place that on record to show that we've now formalised that program.
Thank you, Mr. General Manager. And is this one of the reports that was referred to in the table in the earlier?
Yeah, it's one of the earlier ones.
So that's the first of those.
First of all, so you'll start to see more of these on a regular basis.
Thank you. I resolve that council notes the information provided in the report, and I'll move to item 15.2.
Just again, another short report from the service department, just running across a number of proposals on the operational services area. It's mostly refurbishment of council buildings, in particular DCA 3. We're continuing to do work on that. And the other significant project is the footpath project that's going to run from the airport to Burnt Pine, and the tenders are now being issued, and that work should commence in early April.
Thank you. I resolve that council notes the information provided in the report. I'll move to item 15.3, Mr. Chair.
This is good news for the Administrator. This is what we just wanted to put on the record again. Over the last 3 to 4 months, our electricity team has been working tirelessly on the battery energy storage system. The new Tesla battery has been in play for a number of months now, and we're reporting significant improvements in putting us on the path towards our 100% renewable energy target by 2024. Over the last month, we can confirm that between 1 to 6 hours every day, we're managing deliberately turning off the powerhouse and running the island on battery power that has come through from solar generation during the day. Now that's quite a significant improvement. Why we're heading down this path of 100% renewables. That does produce savings. We needed to find those savings because for this budget period, council staff proposed to the council rules that the only way to keep balance within the electricity fund was to increase the kilowatt charge rate of 70 cents per kilowatt to 74 cents. And council knocked that back and they remained at 70 cents, which created a $200,000 hole in our budget. By putting these sorts of improvements in place, we're starting to save significant monies by using battery power and solar generation. But in future, as that grows, the savings that will continue to generate in the electricity system will go towards further renewable. So our existing network itself is quite old and is requiring significant attention. So the idea is to put us on a path of renewing our network infrastructure across the board and aiming towards that 100% renewable, so that the long-term goal is to reduce costs significantly, charges that we put in place for electricity costs across the island.
Do I interpret you correctly, Mr. General Manager, from what you just said, that in setting the charges for the current period, the council effectively had a deficit budget for the electricity area of $200,000? Is that a correct interpretation?
That was the decision that was taken back in June last year.
So the council's general budget can subsidise the electricity consumers to the extent of an amount in that order. Is that
In that order, yes, because it would have been cross subsidisation back across the there. But electricity is always been cross subsidised for the entire council for a number of years, but we're needing to spend money in that space. That infrastructure requires attention across the network so that we can deliver that service in a more efficient, effective way. So, yes, we need to continue to head down this path of 100% renewables. We need to continue to find savings across the network so that we're not having to charge people more money just for the supply of electricity, but we can take those savings and improve the infrastructure.
So is it correct that users were not fully funded for the operation of electricity supply?
Yeah.
Right, okay. And if you, under the heading in this report, relevance to the strategic planning and resourcing strategy, it refers in the very last few words of the second paragraph to the lifting of the moratorium. I just didn't quite grasp what that related to. Could you explain that?
Yeah, so for a number of years, the island has had a moratorium on solar, the installation of solar. And it's safe to say, and I've got a nod of the head from somebody across the room here, but it was about, it's been a number of years, and some of our solar systems are now heading 15 years old, 10 or 15, between 10 and 15 years old. So they're retired assets now, and they're privately owned assets. But what we've also stopped other people putting new solar. And the primary reason for that is that we actually don't have a smart meter operation here on the island. There are a few smart meters, and I'm talking a handful of them on the island. And smart meters are really important for our grid because smart meters stop the flow of electricity back into the system and overloading the system, which causes breakdowns or blackouts across that system. So we need to one, lift the moratorium eventually to allow people to bring new solar systems in, but that can only be done once we head down the path of having smart meters in place so that we can control generation and not overloading the system.
Thank you. I just didn't quite understand what that reference meant. I resolve that Council 1 notes the information provided in the report, and 2, approves the issuing of an expression of interest to build a financial model for staged improvements for Council to move towards 100% renewable energy sources. And I'll move now to item 16.1, which the item 16 reports from the Manager Planning and Environment, and 16.1 relates to sewage and septic management. Mr. General Manager.
Thanks, Mr. Administrator. This is again another target that has been identified on external audit requirements, and there's significant work that lies ahead for us. I'm very fortunate that we have a new enthusiastic manager who has just joined Council, and he's in month 2 now, maybe 3, and he's now got a report for you to detail what's required.
Thank you, Mr. General Manager. Thank you, Mr. Administrator. The report before you identifies preparatory legal work required to assist in executing compliance activities for on-site sewage systems and mandatory connection to the water assurance scheme for properties within an established distance from the network. This work would be conducted by the Department of Infrastructure with the assistance from NIRC, and would consider existing provisions under the Local Government Act and other relevant legislation, and where necessary, legislative changes would be recommended for approval by the relevant minister. By way of background for this paper, the impacts of wastewater and defective sewage systems on the Norfolk Island environment has been identified in several technical reports, including 2 in 2017, one by ACOM, which investigated water quality impacts at Emily Bay and found impacts were from a combination of human sewage, animal fecal matter and decaying animal matter combined, and found that fresh and marine ecosystems are considered to be impacted with contamination from that. Another report prepared internally by NIRC in 2017 found that water quality in the Carver area is highly contaminated by nutrients and coliforms likely from human and stock sewage. Further to that, regular water quality testing by NIRC of key waterways and outlets to the Norfolk Marine Park has been undertaken since 2017. And pollution of water resources have been demonstrated locally through water quality assessments across the island, highlighting elevated E. coli levels in the island's groundwater aquifers and anecdotal reports of higher incidences of gastroenteritis in times of drought in Norfolk Island when the primary water source, rainwater, has been depleted and water is extracted from creeks or shallow aquifers. So we move down the report further. In response to the above issues that are explained in further detail, the Department of Infrastructure, Transport, Regional Development and Communications is currently planning to install a reticulated sewage network for the Kingston and Arthurs Vale heritage area, which is intended to remove a significant source of fecal contamination from the Kingston catchment. Further to that, as has been mentioned, several environment-related recommendations from the Grassroots External Governance Audit in 2020 were concerning the management of wastewater and septic systems. In particular, recommendation 24 called for the Local Government Act to be amended to insert relevant provisions for on-site sewage management. And recommendation 26 states that NIRC undertake a review to establish the funding mechanism and structure and staff capacity of the NIRC environment team to work with the Department of Infrastructure to drive the implementation for wastewater disposal and sewage reticulation infrastructure and means to achieve acceptable environmental standards. As has been noted, this work would be facilitated and led by the Department of Infrastructure Legal Department, with NIRC providing support throughout the process. So in conclusion, it's concluded that NIRC plans to engage the department on the above legislative matters to identify current authorities and any necessary legislative changes to manage on-site septic systems and connections to the water assurance scheme. And if you have any further questions regarding the paper, I'm willing to assist.
Thank you, Mr. Reid. The photo is a current paper. I've also had the opportunity to inspect some of Council's sewage facilities with Mr. Reid on the ground, and I've noted that some of the existing facilities are ageing and failing. So it's interesting to see that Council is picking up on this. It does partly come out of the commitments that Council is making under the grassroots and the next year recommendations that were adopted in February, which is good to see. And my understanding is that you are doing these things. This report is here just to inform you of that, not to seek particular decision. So with that, I resolve that's the information provided in the report, and I'll move to item 16.2, which relates to Building Better Regions grant funding applications. Mr. General Manager.
Thanks, Mr. Administrator. Before you use the report, the details of the number of applications that have been made, so it's for notation, but it was important for us to let you know that these applications have been made, and they are also addressing some external audit findings, which is noted on page 99 of where we're heading. But in essence, it's around water security, the water assurance scheme, and the extension of, and the last one is a new jail tourism infrastructure enhancement project. So, sorry, on this one, the circular economy, which is to do with waste management. So that's what you have before you today. If the manager would like to add some more.
Mr. Reid, do you wish to add anything?
Just with regards to the water security project, in more detail, that funding applications for the installation of 7 rainwater tanks adjacent to existing buildings across the island to augment our existing rainwater tank infrastructure. As was noted with the water assurance scheme, the proposal for that funding grant is to extend the scheme to rural and residential properties that are currently not connected and are considered to be having a detrimental impact on downstream water quality in Kingston. And as was mentioned with the circular economy, it's an upgrade and extension of existing waste management infrastructure facilities, which was put forward in order to end the practice of waste entering the marine park.
Thank you, Mr. Reid. I resolve that Council notes the information provided in the report, and I'll move to item 16.3 relating to the delegation of Council function for recommendations on development applications under the Planning Act 2002, Norfolk Island. Mr. General Manager.
I won't spell the manager standard here, but in essence, again, this is trying to address a number of things identified in external audit findings. But the detail of that is
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. General Manager, and thank you, Mr. Administrator. So the summary of this report is to recommend that Council makes a resolution under section 3771 of the Local Government Act to delegate to the General Manager Council's functions specified in sections 44.2 and 44.4 of the Planning Act, to make recommendations on development applications for permissible with consent use or development, and to refer those recommendations to the Minister in accordance with the conditions presented in this report. To move further down the paper, it is proposed that Council's functions to consider and make recommendations to the Minister on DAs classified as permissible with consent use or development, and on applications to modify development approval permissible with consent use or development are delegated to the General Manager for the majority of such applications would improve efficiencies and reduce determination timeframes. To do this work, the DAs for permissible with consent use or development that were referred to Council under Section 44(1) in 2019 and 2020 have been generally analysed to consider whether improvements to efficiencies can be made to the DA process, with the aim to shorten the period of time taken to determine DAs, to decrease the number of steps and reports prepared to achieve a determination of DAs, and achieve the most effective use of staff resources. And at that point, Mr. Administrator, I might move to the actual recommendations or the recommended criteria for delegated council's functions under Section 44(2) and 44(4). To the General Manager, Table 3. I'll move through each one of these line by line based on use or development type. So the first for all use and development types that also meet the other other relevant criteria for delegation to the General Manager, the recommendation is less than 5 submissions. I stand corrected. It would be less than 5 objections received in response to invitation for public comment on the DA. With regards to compliance with requirements of New South Wales Plan and Development Control Plans. The minor variations to standards. A variation of any quantified development standard is 10% or less. Ancillary development. New development is ancillary to existing permanent use or development. Alterations and additions and extensions to existing development that comply with other criteria for delegation. The change of use only to existing development. That the change of use to existing development that also includes new development alterations and additions and extensions that comply with all other relevant criteria for delegation. Modification of development approval, so not a modification of an existing development approval, noting that modification only applies where the modification results in substantially the same development. Otherwise, a new DA would be required, and applies to modification to extend lapsing date, modification of conditions of development approval, or minor change to approved plans. For residential, change or use and development of new dual occupancy, 2 dwellings and multiple dwellings up to 5 units. With regards to subdivision, no more than 2 additional lots to be created. For tourist accommodation, change of use of existing residence or other existing development of tourist accommodation, holiday home or Airbnb. Development of new tourist accommodation units up to 5 units. Community, council, and government development. Change of use and development of new community public buildings and works. Prescribed use or development where the requirement for an environmental impact statement is waived. Use and development within the heritage overlay except for Carver. The general criteria applies. And use and development in the coastal environment overlay and buffer area, and also that the general criteria applies.
Mr. Reid, can I just stop you there for a moment, and for the benefit of people who may be watching this webcast or listening to the audio streaming, the provisions that you have just referred for are the recommended criteria for delegating council's functions under Section 44(2) and Section 44(4) to the General Manager to make recommendations on DAs to the Minister's Delegate.
Correct.
In the past, those transactions would have flowed from Council's management to the elected council or to the Council's governing body to make a recommendation to the Minister's Delegate. This proposal allows that to occur under delegation directly from the General Manager to the Minister's Delegate. Okay, so I'll stop you there. If you go on, I think we'll just separate because this will save me having to read all of these provisions again when we get to a resolution. So you're on the middle of page 105.
Sure, and that took us to the end of Table 3, which, as you mentioned, is the recommended criteria criteria for delegating council's functions, whereby the general manager would make those recommendations to the council. At that point, I would, by distinction, move to table 4, which would be the recommended conditions and circumstances where DAs would not be subject to delegation of council functions under section 44.2 and 44.4 of the Planning Act, and therefore would go to council, continue to go to council.
Right.
So those recommended criteria are: the DA does not comply with one or more of the criteria for delegating council's functions under sections 44.2 and 44.4 to general manager to make recommendations on development applications to the minister's delegate. In other words, the table that I've previously read out. Criteria 2, all DAs for use and development in Carver. For criteria 3, DAs for prescribed use or development where an environmental impact statement accompanies the DA. For criteria 4, DAs that are called in for consideration by council at council's discretion, provided the following conditions are met. And I'll make a point with this set of criteria, Mr. Administrator, that there is a wording change compared to what is in the papers, that the first being the decision of council to call in the DA is made by vote and by a majority of councillors. On the paper, it has an and after that would be replaced by all. So if there was a majority of councillors that wished to call in a DA that requires consent for consideration by council, they could do that simply as a majority of councillors. Or the proposed activity is at publicly owned land and the proposed activity is for a private activity or commercial activity or public building or public works that require consent. The final criteria, DAs that the general manager determines to refer to the council at his or her discretion.
Thank you. And if I could just stop you there and ask a question about row 4 in the table. Where you refer to DAs being called in by council, is that a reference, is the reference to council a reference to council's governing body?
Council, correct.
So, I'm just not 100% clear as to whether that relates to individual councillors or to the entire governing body of council,
Sure.
in terms of how that's expressed.
Right. So I understand that if 4 sitting councillors under normal, five sitting councillors under normal circumstances.
Or the administrator at the present time.
Correct.
Yeah.
And that in which case it would be a minimum of 3 councillors that would be required to call a DA that requires consent in for consideration by the collective council at a council meeting. So that is a criteria in and of itself. And
So if I can stop you there,
sure.
How would that occur? Is that by resolution of councillors or by a request to the general manager?
A request to the general manager outside of
So it doesn't have to go away to council.
No, it would not.
The councillors see there's a list of DAs and there's one that they're interested in
Yes.
approving themselves or making recommendations about themselves. They can administratively notify the GM if there's a majority of councillors who wish to do that. I just think in terms of this being an ongoing delegation, so what our reference to council means here, a reference to the majority of the governing body of council, something like that.
We can make that change. That makes sense. And maybe something along the lines of administrative. So that all that would be required would be 3 councillors.
So,
that would be sufficient.
so it was certainly not the intent of these recommendations that would need to be resolved as part of a council meeting. It would sort of be counter to the intent of those delegations being made for it to have to go through 2 council meetings, in which case.
Right. Okay, now I interrupted you, so please continue.
But I think I'd resolve at that point those criteria with regards to which the council would continue to make recommendations to the minister or the minister's delegate for development approvals requiring consent. And at that point, it is concluded that under the recommended delegations, so DAs that comply with the criteria as they were put forward in Table 3, for delegating council's functions under sections 44.2 and 44.4 of the Planning Act, would be referred to the General Manager to make recommendations on the DA, the Minister's Delegate, and refer the DA and the General Manager's recommendations to the Minister's Delegate.
Yep.
And DAs that meet the conditions specified in Table 4 subject to those wording changes would be referred to the Council to make a recommendation to the Minister's Delegate and refer the Council's recommendation to the Minister's Delegate.
Thank you.
Finished? That's it. Okay, good. I recall making some observations myself about the nature of some of the development applications that came before me at the Federal Council meeting, and suggesting that some of those applications, there was only a small number, but they were basically for very routine matters that in other councils would normally be dealt with under delegated authority by the General Manager or people in the council's management reporting to the General Manager. And so this report is in line with my thinking on how this process should operate within the council. So I resolve then that under section 3771 of the Local Government Act 1993, council resolves, that's a slight change, council resolves to, have we got that? Thank you. To delegate to the General Manager council's functions specified in sections 44.2 and 4 of the Planning Act 2002, Norfolk Island, to make recommendations on development applications for permissible with consent use or development, and refer those recommendations to the Minister in accordance with the conditions presented in this report, in particular, Table 3, recommended criteria for delegating council's functions under section 44.2 and 4 of the Planning Act 2002, Norfolk Island. Table 3 is as printed in the agenda for item 16.3 today on today's business paper. So table 3 as printed in the agenda. And then going on from that, and table 4, recommended conditions and circumstances where DAs would not be subject to delegation of council functions under section 44.2 and 4 of the Planning Act 2002, Norfolk Island. And table 4 is as printed in the agenda with an amendment to item number 4 in table 4 to read DAs that are called in for consideration by the majority of the governing body of council at council's discretion, provided the following conditions are met. Full stop. This may occur administratively. Full stop. And then paragraph A, the decision of council to call in the DA is made by vote and by a majority of councillors, or B, the proposed activity is at publicly owned land, and C, the proposed activity is for a private activity or commercial activity or public building or public works that require consent. And 5, DA is that the General Manager determines to refer to the Council at his or her discretion. Is that covered?
Understood.
So resolved. Now for the minutes, did we get all that? Thank you. And I'll move to item 16. Item 16.4 relates to an application for significant development declaration at Kingston Pier Channel Augmentation Project. Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. General Manager. Thank you, Mr. Administrator. As with the previous papers, I don't propose to read through the entire paper in its entirety, but in summary, the purpose of this report is for Council to consider an application for declaration in relation to significant development for the proposed augmentation of the existing Kingston Pier Channel to increase its depth and width, and to make a recommendation about the application to Minister's Delegate. Amendments to the Planning Act 2002 were prepared to introduce a specific development assessment pathway for major public infrastructure, which came into effect in October 2018, commonly known as significant development. The pathway has 2 key stages: declaration and development assessment. Application has been made for the Kingston Channel Augmentation Project to be declared significant development and accepted for development assessment under that pathway. The application has been submitted by the Department of Infrastructure, Transport, Regional Development and Communications, and the subject land is Kingston Pier, portion 182, and land adjacent to the pier, portion 164, both Crown land, and the site of the former quarry, portion 501, which was privately owned. It's noted that the landowners have provided consent for the application for declaration in relation to significant development. By way of additional background, the existing Kingston Channel has been identified as inadequate and safe navigating during all tides and does not meet required navigation standards. In addition, the existing limited water depth of the channel at low tides is a safety risk for users due to inadequate underkeel clearance, which restricts the opportunities to use Kingston Pier. And further to the discussion, the project, the proposed augmentation of Kingston Pier Channel is eligible to be declared significant development under Part 3A, significant developments of the Act, as it is a type of infrastructure prescribed in Clause 15A of the Planning Regulations, namely important work infrastructure and public works, major as defined in the Norfolk Island Plan. Clause 15B, the regulations requires a report. The General Manager refers to the Norfolk Island Regional Council under subsection 28C1 of the Act, must include consideration of the matters mentioned in paragraphs 28D to A to D of the Act. The matters have been addressed by the applicant in the application. The General Manager's consideration of the matters generally concurs with the applicant's consideration, and conclusion that the proposal is consistent with the concept of significant development. The General Manager's consideration is summarised in the paper. The key criteria by which the development needs to be assessed against include any potential economic or community benefits from the development, any need the development has or could have with other developments, consistency with the Norfolk Island Plan, the Norfolk Island Regional Council's Community Strategic Plan, Delivery Program and Operational Plan, and any other matters considered by the Commonwealth Minister to be relevant. In conclusion, the augmentation of the Kingston Pier Channel project is a significant project with potential to deliver economic and community benefits to the Norfolk Island community over many years, and to enable Council to fulfil a commitment to rehabilitate the land of the former Cascade Quarry. The project is significant public infrastructure and warrants environmental and development assessment through the significant development pathway under Part 3A of the Planning Act 2002.
Thank you, Mr. Reid. I have had the opportunity to inspect where the channel lies, and I accept the information provided in the report and the advice that the proposed development should be treated as significant development, and therefore I intend to make that declaration. So I resolve that 1, Norfolk Island Regional Council agrees with the General Manager's conclusions that the proposed Kingston Pier Channel augmentation project is one, eligible for declaration of significant development, and two, based on the matters required to be considered under section 28D to A to E of the Planning Act 2002 Norfolk Island, warrants declaration as a significant development, and two, pursuant to section 28C2 of the Planning Act 2002 Norfolk Island, the Norfolk Island Regional Council recommends that the proposed Kingston Pier Channel augmentation project be declared significant development, and three, pursuant to section 28C4 of the Planning Act 2002 Norfolk Island, the Norfolk Island Regional Council refers its recommendation to the Commonwealth Minister with the General Manager's report and any other relevant material. And I'll move to item 16.5, which relates to development and building application DA-BA 12/2021. Mr. Chairman.
Before you say a simple DA, happy to recommendations on page 17.
Thank you. Mr. Reid, could you just give a brief description of the development, please? I need to go right through the report, just for the record, so that people watching the meeting understand which project or which application you're referring to, please.
So the development application 12/2021, the applicant is the Department of Infrastructure, Transport, Regional Development and Communities. The subject land is portion 44D, Collinshead Road, at the Norfolk Island Central School, and the proposed use or development is classified as an educational establishment, an indoor and outdoor recreational facility, specifically a sports oval pavilion. Further to that, the proposal is to develop a sports pavilion type facility at the Norfolk Island Central School. The application, the application seeks approval for the demolition of 4 existing structures and the construction of 1 structure to be used by the Norfolk Island Central School and other community groups for use as a sports shed and pavilion, and for the storage of sports equipment within the school grounds and immediately adjacent to the school oval, formerly called the Malcolm Champion Oval. The building would include amenities, an extensive wraparound veranda, and the interior would be generally open plan. There were no submissions received in response to the invitation for written submissions on the application, and council staff assessed the proposal and concluded the proposed development would be of great benefit to the community, in particular the school. The development complies with the objectives, requirements and standards in the plan. The Senior Strategic Planners Report recommends that the Council recommends to the Minister's Delegate that the application be approved, subject to the recommended conditions in the recommended notice of decision.
Thank you, Mr. Reid. I've reviewed the report and I concur with the recommendation that this application should be recommended for approval. So I resolve that 1, the Norfolk Island Regional Council, pursuant to section 44(2) of the Planning Act 2002 Norfolk Island, in accordance with the statutory requirements of that Act and in accordance with the recommended notice of decision, makes a recommendation to approve DA-BA 12/2021, described as applicant, Department of Infrastructure, Transport, Regional Development and Communities, subject land, portion 44D, Collinshead Road, Norfolk Island Central School, proposed use or development, educational establishment and indoor and outdoor recreation facility, sports oval pavilion, and 2, the Norfolk Island Regional Council, pursuant to section 44(4) of the Planning Act 2002 Norfolk Island, refers DA-BA 12/2021 to the Minister's Delegate with Council's recommendation or recommendations on the application. And I move to item 16.6, which relates to development and building application DA-BA 13/2021. Mr. General Manager.
Thanks, Mr. Administrator. And again, DAs for you from the Department of Infrastructure, Transport, Regional Development, portion 164 Pier Street, Kingston. And it's refurbishment of the civil hospital stabilisation work. I'll hand across to the manager. Details.
Mr. Reid.
Thank you, Mr. Administrator. Thank you, Mr. General Manager. The remains of the former civil hospital building located in Kingston and Eldersvale historic area. The international heritage significance of Carver is recognised in the inclusion of the site on the World Heritage List. Carver is also identified as a heritage item subject to the heritage overlay in the Norfolk Island Plan. Under clause 74 of the plan, all use and development of land within the heritage overlay requires development consent. The subject land is zoned conservation and the works permissible with consent. Further to that, the civil hospital remains are predominantly walls and stone steps, and there's no roof over the remains. The application seeks approval to construct a gable bracing at the northern end of the building to prevent the northern gable wall from separating from the rest of the building structure. The bracing would not require a roof, but the outline of the bracing structure would be visible in the cultural landscape. The maximum height of the bracing would be 5.3 metres to the top of the gable. The bracings in the frame would be constructed of timber. It is also noted that the works are planned as preventative measures to stabilise the structure and for public safety. In addition, the application is accompanied with a heritage impact statement that concludes the works can be defined as preservation work as defined by the Borough Charter, and the remediation works have been developed through an options assessment with input from a heritage specialist at each stage. There were no submissions received in response to the invitation for written submissions on the application, and council staff assessed the proposal and concluded that proposed works are necessary to stabilise the building structure and to maintain public safety. The works comply with the objectives, requirements and standards in the plan. The Senior Strategic Planner's report recommends the council recommends to the Minister's delegate that the application be approved subject to the recommended conditions.
Thank you, Mr. Reid. I have read this application. I have inspected the site with Mr. Reid. I agree with the Senior Strategic Planner's assessment of the application. I've taken into account studies and plans that have been attached to the application, and I resolve that 1. The Norfolk Island Regional Council, pursuant to section 44(2) of the Planning Act 2002, Norfolk Island, in accordance with the statutory requirements of that Act, and in accordance with the recommended notice of decision, makes a recommendation to approve DABA 13/2021, described as applicant, Department of Infrastructure, Transport, Regional Development and Communities, subject land, portion 164, Pier Street, Kingston, proposed use or development, public building, refurbishment, civil hospital stabilisation works, and 2, the Norfolk Island Regional Council, pursuant to section 44(4) of the Planning Act 2002, Norfolk Island, refers DABA 13/2021 to the Minister's delegate with Council's recommendations on the application. And I'll move to item 16.7, which is the Planning and Environment Update. Mr. General Manager.
Thanks again, Mr. Administrator. Here's a good news story from Council. It's quite detailed. It covers a significant amount of work that the Planning and Environment has been undertaking for the last month. So, without standing this under, I'll pass Mr. Manager of Planning and Environment to give you a short update.
Mr. Reid.
Thank you, Mr. Administrator, Mr. General Manager. The summary of the report before you is summarising planning and environment activities for the reporting period, includes planning and building approvals, waste and environment, public health, and environmental protection and reserves. I have not intended on pointing at any specific parts of this report for mention. It's there for consideration for your reading. I'm open to any questions should you have them.
I don't have any questions on this report specifically. It speaks for itself effectively. I would like to ask the General Manager to ensure that with these news stories such as this, and there are others throughout this business labour, that we endeavour to provide some positive publicity in the local media Council has access to. to get some of these stories out. So I'm hearing regularly from the community that they want to be informed about what's going on. I think Council's monthly business paper provides the opportunity, particularly for items like this, for us to get that news out through use of the local media if possible. So having said that, I resolved that council notes the information provided in the report, and I move to item 16.8, the final Norfolk Island Regional Council Pest Management Plan 2021 to 2026. Mr. General.
Thanks, Mr. Administrator. Again, this has been within the public domain for a period of time. The report highlights it's been in public exhibition for 56 days. It's a very detailed report. I'll hand across to the manager to just detail some of the costings and key actions that will come from these.
Mr. Reid.
Thank you, Mr. Administrator and Mr. General Manager. So before you is a report on the final Norfolk Island Regional Council Pest Management Plan 2021 to 2026. In summary, the draft Norfolk Island Regional Council Pest Management Plan was prepared in late 2020, and as mentioned by the General Manager, it was placed in public exhibition for a period of 56 days, as recommended by the NIRC Public Reserves Advisory Committee. The public submission period closed on the 20th of November 2020. The feedback received from the community was considered, and a total of 51 edits were made during preparation of the final Norfolk Island Regional Council Pest Management Plan. At that point, I might just identify some of the key features of the plan. The plan itself explains a number of the issues facing the Norfolk Island environment, both by way of pest animals and pest plants. And, some of the more notable pest animals that we have here on Norfolk Island include rats, free-roaming cats, feral chickens, red parrots or crimson rosella, and of course Argentine ants. And with regards to weed species on Norfolk Island, there are a number of weed species here, but the more predominant ones include Hawaiian holly, red guava, and African olive. So the report very much features those as well as other pest species, and formulates a number of strategic directions which I'll just briefly mention, including preventing the establishment of new pest plants and animals and other pests, reducing the impacts of existing pest plants and animals and other pests, to improve leadership and the coordination for the management of pest plants and animals and other pests, and finally the use of best practice techniques and value for money in executing the actions that are put forward as part of this plan. Further to the point regarding the costed implementation of key actions contained within this plan. So a draft indicative budget as at February 2021 for the establishment of the Island Conservation Management Network and the implementation of key high priority actions from the Norfolk Island Regional Council Pest Management Plan is detailed before you in the paper in Table 1. Most high priority actions within the plan would be implemented as part of the proposed Norfolk Island Conservation Management Network coordinator role. It's noted that the required budget for pest, plant and animal control programs within public reserves is not included within this budget. The funding required to implement and maintain pest, plant and animal control programs and revegetation programs within public reserves is detailed separately within the public reserves implementation and maintenance plan. So you'll see in Table 1 there are a number of costed items with regards to implementation of key actions within the pest management plan. Some of the more notable actions there are the forming of a Norfolk Island Conservation Management Network coordinator role, incentives for targeted private land weed control in priority areas, incentives for private land revegetation in priority areas, free roaming cat control in public and private land, rodent control, in other words, coordinated control across public and private land in high priority areas, feral chicken, red parrot and tailbird control on public and private land, and the development of a weed control handbook. And these are costed at an annual iteration with an annual cost in the order of $298,000. So, I guess in conclusion, the final Norfolk Island Regional Council Pest Management Plan 2021 to 2026 is before Council for endorsement, but it is important to note that the endorsement of this plan by Council does not necessarily guarantee funding for the establishment of the Norfolk Island Conservation Management Network as detailed in the plan, or guarantee funding for the implementation of all actions within the plan. That would be an outcome of having this plan endorsed to seek funding for those actions moving in.
Thank you, Mr. Reid. I'm satisfied that this plan provides a useful and appropriate basis for pest management on Norfolk Island, and I resolve in relation to this item that the Norfolk Island Regional Council endorse the final Norfolk Island Regional Council Pest Management Plan 2021 to 2026, and I'll move to item 17.1. This is under the heading report from the Manager Customer Service. 17.1 relates to the value of general Norfolk Island contract.
Mr. Administrator, before you report the detail, the contract that we currently hold is valued at 30 June 2021. So prior to issuing a new contract, I'm recommending that we approach the market to go and find the qualified value of general according to the Regulations Act 2012 Norfolk Island. Just for information, the provision of these land valuation services that we do have is via the SDA, so the service delivery agreement that we have with the Construction Department, Highway. Any agreement that we enter into will be dependent on the statutory appointment by the Minister. It will also be subject to a word funding from
Thank you, Mr. General Manager. I'm satisfied that it is appropriate at this stage to seek expressions of interest in the delivery of land valuation services. So I resolve that Council approve the General Manager to seek expressions of interest for the delivery of land valuation services on Norfolk Island. And I'll move to item 17.2, which relates to tertiary bursary scholarships for 2021. Mr. General Manager.
Mr. Administrator, before you is a report to detail applications that Council has received for its annual tertiary education bursary scholarship program. This year we received 20 applications, of which only 18 were eligible to be shortlisted. The ineligible applications were received after specified closing time, and they were also incomplete. So before you, we recommend the awarding of 18 scholarships to a value of $1,100 each to the following names: Corey Anderson, Holly Bigg, William Elliott, Tilly Menzies Thompson, Bronte Hudson, Kalani Evans, Taylor Menzies, Tiger Lily Sheridan, Hannah Bigg, Curtis Buffett, Harrison Hayes, Tiana Christian, Reese Metz, Charlie Carr, Millicent Clark, Isabel Ward, Zoe Wright, and Anthony Evans. Each of those 18 applicants are recommended to receive $1,100. Total of the program is $19,800, which falls within the Council's adopted budget of $22,100.
Thank you, Mr. General Manager. My understanding from what you just said to me and from other inquiries that I've made is that everyone who applied, who was eligible in terms of the application process, has been recommended for funding. So whilst there were 20 applicants, two applications were not eligible, but everyone else who applied and met the qualification, the requisite qualifications, is received, or it's recommended that they receive bursary under this report. Is that correct?
Yes.
Okay, then I resolve that Council endorses the payment of tertiary education grant funds to the 18 shortlisted applicants contained in the body of this report to the value specified in the table, the total value of scholarships paid not exceeding $19,800. And I'll move to item 18.1, which is a notice of motion from myself, and I'll just explain the background to this notice of motion. At the February Council meeting, I was required to confirm some minutes of the preceding Council meeting held in December, and there were references in that agenda to moves by the former governing body of Council to seek a royal commission in relation to Council's operations. And I gave notice at that meeting that I would bring forward to the next Council meeting, the next ordinary Council meeting, of which this is that next meeting, to rescind such unimplemented aspects of the earlier decisions related to lobbying the Minister to institute a Royal Commission in relation to Norfolk Island Regional Council. The minutes, item 7.2 of the minutes of the December Council meeting included a resolution relating to advocacy for a Royal Commission. When confirming those minutes at the Council meeting, as I said, on the 24th of February, I gave notice that since it's self-evidently inappropriate for a council whose governing body comprises an interim administrator appointed by the Minister to be pursuing the Minister to establish a Royal Commission to examine the most appropriate form of government for Norfolk Island when a public inquiry has already been initiated for the term of this interim administration, Council proposes, or I as Council's governing body propose to rescind such outstanding aspects of the Council resolutions that led to this position that have not already been actioned, in order to cease any further advocacy of that kind for the time being, that is for the period of the interim administration. Copies of the relevant resolutions are attached to today's business paper. And I take on board the comments that were made by the Speaker, speaking both for Robin Adams and for Mr. Snell in his own right. I've taken on board the comments that they have made, and I just underscore the point that the purpose of this decision is to put on hold any further action. The Council has already implemented some actions, those things have occurred, but this is to put on hold so that effectively Council is not, during a period of interim administration, is not pursuing a Minister to institute or have established a Royal Commission for that purpose. So having said that, I have moved by giving notice of motion, and I hereby resolve that in order to put any further advocacy by Norfolk Island Regional Council in pursuit of a Royal Commission to examine the most appropriate form of government for Norfolk Island on hold, I hereby rescind so much of resolutions 2020/143 and 2020/187 as have not already been actioned by Council. So resolved. And move now to item 19. Mr. General Manager, is there any urgent business without notice? No. And I note that there are no confidential matters for consideration, and there are no questions for the next Council meeting. So if there is no further business, Mr. General Manager? None?
None.
Then I close the meeting of Council at 3:58 p.m. and thank everybody for their attendance.
Thanks, Mike.